They called him the village idiot. While his neighbors erected million-dollar glass mansions, Auden built his house out of dirt. They laughed, snapping photos of his mud hut. But when the worst blizzard in a century severed the power grid, the laughing stopped. Those luxury homes became freezing tubes. The affluent enclave of Pine Ridge, Montana was a testament to modern arrogance. Nestled in a picturesque valley, flanked by the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range, it was the kind of place where out-of-state tech executives and wealthy retirees came to build their ultimate architectural fantasies. The landscape was soon dotted with sprawling, multi-level chalets featuring floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows, vaulted ceilings, and complex app-controlled smart heating systems. Then there was Auden Clark. Auden was a retired geotechnical engineer from Chicago, a quiet, broad-shouldered man in his late 60s who had purchased a modest, south-facing plot of land at the edge of the valley. When the flatbed trucks began arriving at his property, the neighbors expected steel I-beams, imported Italian marble, or at the very least, premium Douglas fir timber. Instead, they watched in absolute bewilderment as dump trucks unloaded massive piles of local clay, sand, and gravel. Richard Gable, a former hedge fund manager who had just finished building a 6,000-square-foot steel and glass modernist estate directly up the hill, was the first to voice the neighborhood's collective disdain. "The man is building a giant sandcastle," Richard scoffed one afternoon, standing on his heated driveway with his wife Brenda and the local general contractor Thomas Higgins. "Look at him down there. It's an eyesore. A literal mud hut. It's going to drive our property values straight into the ground." Thomas Higgins, a man whose livelihood depended on pouring concrete and framing timber, chuckled, shaking his head. "It's called rammed earth, Mr. Gable. It's an ancient technique. You mix dirt with a tiny bit of cement and tamp it down. But out here, in this climate, the guy is out of his mind. One harsh winter and that glorified clay pot is going to crack right open." Despite the whispers, the pointed fingers, and the occasional hostile glare at the local hardware store, Auden worked relentlessly. He hired a small, bewildered local crew and set up heavy wooden forms. Day after day, the pneumatic tampers pounded the soil mixture into rock-hard, 2-foot-thick walls. The walls rose slowly, revealing beautiful, undulating striations of terracotta, ochre, and deep brown. But to the residents of Pine Ridge, it wasn't art. It was poverty. It was primitive. Brenda Gable, who sat on the local homeowners association board, even tried to halt the construction. She filed a formal complaint with County Commissioner David Roswell, citing aesthetic incompatibility with the neighborhood. Roswell, however, found that Auden's permits were perfectly in order. The home met every structural code required by the county. "I don't care what the county says," Brenda fumed during a neighborhood dinner party, swirling her expensive Cabernet. "It's an insult. We have underfloor radiant heating, triple-pane, argon-filled windows, and backup lithium battery walls. He has dirt. When the snow comes, he'll be begging to sleep in our garage." Auden ignored them all. He designed his home using strict passive solar principles. The entire south-facing side featured heavily insulated glass angled perfectly to catch the low winter sun, while the north, east, and west walls were massive, solid earthen barriers burrowed slightly into the hillside. The roof was heavily insulated and topped with a living layer of soil and hardy local grasses. By late October, Auden's home was finished. It sat low and unassuming against the landscape, blending completely into the autumnal colors of the valley. In stark contrast, Richard and Brenda Gable's mansion loomed above like a glowing, transparent spaceship, bleeding light and heat into the frigid night sky. When Auden ran into Richard at the local post office a week before Thanksgiving, Richard couldn't resist a final jab. "Claw," Richard said, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "Winter's coming. I hope you stocked up on extra blankets for that cave of yours." If you ever need to warm up, my smart thermostat keeps our living room at a perfect 72 degrees. Just don't track mud on the white rugs." Auden looked at the younger man, his weathered face completely passive. He adjusted his canvas jacket. "The earth remembers the heat, Richard. Glass forgets it the second the sun goes down. Keep your generator serviced." Richard laughed aloud, walking away. "Crazy old fool." The National Weather Service called it a once-in-a-generation meteorological anomaly. It began 3 days after Thanksgiving. A massive polar vortex displaced from the Arctic collided violently with a moisture-heavy Pacific storm system right over the Rockies. They called it a bomb cyclone, but the scientific terms didn't capture the sheer sudden violence of the event. At 2 p.m. on Tuesday, the temperature in Pine Ridge was a brisk but manageable 30 degrees. By 6 p.m., it was 0. By midnight, it had plummeted to 35 degrees below zero, accompanied by sustained, screaming winds of 60 miles per hour. Inside his blast palace, Richard Gable awoke at 3:15 a.m. to a sound that made his blood run cold: absolute silence. The low, constant hum of his home's massive HVAC system was gone. The glowing digital displays on his smart thermostats were dead. He threw off his heavy duvet, shivering instantly as the ambient air in the master bedroom bit into his skin. "Richard," Brenda mumbled, pulling the covers up to her chin. "Why is it so cold?" "Power's out," Richard said, his breath pluming in the white cloud in the dark room. "Don't worry, the automated backup batteries should kick in." But they didn't when Richard stumbled down the hallway to the utility room, relying on the flashlight on his phone. He discovered the catastrophic flaw in his high-tech system. The lithium battery banks, installed in the uninsulated, attached 3-car garage, had experienced a sudden, extreme temperature drop. Lithium batteries possess a critical vulnerability to deep freezing. The system's internal safety mechanisms had locked the batteries down to prevent chemical damage. They were bricked. Panic began to flutter in Richard's chest. He looked out his massive 20-foot-high living room windows. The world outside was a swirling, opaque nightmare of horizontal white. The wind shrieked against the glass, causing the entire steel frame of the house to groan. Those beautiful panoramic windows, the pride of the house, were now a massive liability. Despite being triple-paned, glass is a terrible insulator compared to solid mass. The sheer surface area of the windows was sucking the heat out of the house at an astonishing rate. By dawn, the interior temperature of the Gable mansion had dropped to 30 degrees. Down the hill, Thomas Higgins, the contractor, was facing his own nightmare. His sprawling modern farmhouse was rapidly turning into an icebox. The high, vaulted ceilings trapped what little heat was left far above the living space, leaving the ground floor freezing. At 7 a.m., a loud crack echoed through his house, the sound of the water in his pipes freezing and splitting the copper plumbing wide open. By noon the next day, the situation in Pine Ridge transitioned from an inconvenience to a life-threatening emergency. The roads were completely impassable, buried under 4 feet of drifting snow. The county plows had been pulled off the roads due to zero visibility. Cell phone towers, their backup generators freezing or running out of fuel, began to fail. The valley was entirely cut off from the outside world. Up in the glass mansion, things were becoming desperate. Richard and Brenda were huddled in their interior walk-in closet, wearing ski gear, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The temperature in their main living space had dropped to 5 degrees below zero. Frost was forming on the inside of their expensive windows. "We're going to freeze to death," Brenda sobbed, her lips tinted a terrifying shade of blue. "Richard, do something. Start a fire." "Dim what?" Richard snapped, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "We have a decorative, fuelless gas fireplace that requires electricity to run the safety valves. We don't have a real chimney." Their modern, hyper-engineered home had become a beautiful, deadly trap. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the hill, Auden Clark sat in his favorite armchair, wearing a light flannel shirt, reading a hardcover biography by the soft golden glow of a kerosene lamp. The interior of his mud house was a balmy 68 degrees. Auden's house was performing exactly as the ancient physics of rammed earth dictated. For the past 6 months, his 2-foot-thick earthen walls had been slowly absorbing the heat of the summer and autumn sun. Now insulated by the earth berms on 3 sides and the snow on the roof, that massive thermal battery was doing its job. The walls were gently, steadily radiating months of stored heat back into the living space. Furthermore, because the house was relatively compact and lacked the cavernous, heat-stealing, vaulted ceilings of his neighbors, the warmth stayed close to the floor. Earlier that morning, when the storm briefly broke and the sun hit the southern windows, the dark flagstone floors had greedily absorbed the solar radiation, adding even more heat to the home. Auden had a small, highly efficient wood-burning stove, but he hadn't even needed to light it yet. The mud walls were doing all the work. He walked over to his deep-set southern window, leaning his hand against the smooth, warm clay of the wall. He peered through the blast, trying to see through the blinding squalls. He knew the power was out. He had seen the transformers blowing in bursts of blue sparks down the valley the night before. He looked up the hill toward the Gable estate. It was practically invisible in the whiteout, but Auden knew exactly what was happening inside those glass walls. He knew the physics of it. "They're freezing," Auden muttered to himself, his brow furrowing in concern. He didn't hold a grudge. Auden was a pragmatist. He knew that pride and ignorance were a dangerous combination, but they didn't warrant a death sentence. He walked over to his mudroom, pulling down his heavy sub-zero Arctic parka, his insulated bib, and his snowshoes. He grabbed a heavy coil of climbing rope, tying one end securely to the sturdy iron latch of his heavy oak front door. If he lost his bearings in the whiteout, he needed a lifeline back to the mud house. He opened the door, and the sheer violence of the 50-below wind chill hit him like a physical blow. Pulling his goggles down, Auden stepped out into the blinding maelstrom, beginning the grueling upward trek toward the blast mansion. The wind did not merely blow, it clawed. As Auden Clark forced his weight forward, the sheer force of the blizzard threatened to peel him off the face of the hill. Every step in his wide, aluminum-framed snowshoes required agonizing effort. The snow was drifting in massive, unpredictable waves, some knee-deep, others swallowing him to his waist. He moved methodically, a solitary dark speck in a swirling universe of aggressive white. Every 50 feet he paused, looped his thick nylon climbing rope around the trunk of the freezing, wind-whipped pine tree, secured a knot, and pressed on. He was navigating by memory alone. The towering, angular silhouette of the Gable mansion was entirely swallowed by the whiteout conditions. At 68 years old, Auden possessed a sturdy, deliberate strength, but the -50-degree wind chill was beginning to seep through his heavy Arctic gear, numbing his extremities. After 40 grueling minutes of climbing a slope that normally took 10 minutes to walk, Auden's gloved hand struck something hard, smooth, and metallic. He wiped away a thick layer of rime ice to reveal the aluminum railing of Richard Gable's expansive, multi-tiered deck. Auden hauled himself over the railing and stumbled toward the massive glass facade of the house. The sight was surreal. The Gables' home, designed to be a transparent pavilion of light and luxury, looked like the hull of a sunken ghost ship. Frost had crystallized in fractal patterns across the inside of the supposedly state-of-the-art triple-pane windows. The interior was shrouded in a gloomy, freezing twilight. He pounded on the heavy glass door with his heavy fist. "Richard, Brenda." "Blah. Sour worry." His voice was instantly swallowed by the shrieking wind. He tried the handle. It was an electronic smart lock, dead and frozen solid. He had anticipated this. Auden reached into his deep parka pocket and retrieved a heavy, steel-headed geological hammer remnant from his career taking core samples. He didn't hesitate. Auden swung the hammer with practiced, focused force, striking the bottom corner of a side-entry glass pane. The tempered glass held for a fraction of a second before exploding inward with a dull crunch, showering the hardwood floor inside with glittering, icy diamonds. Auden climbed through the jagged opening, immediately feeling the crunch of frost beneath his boots on the imported Brazilian walnut flooring. The silence inside was almost more terrifying than the storm outside. The temperature in the living room was easily 0 degrees. The high vaulted ceiling, meant to evoke the feeling of an open cathedral, had acted as a vacuum, sucking every last BTU of warmth away from the living space and dissipating it through the roof. "Lights Earth!" Auden bellowed, his breath pluming in thick white clouds. A faint, muffled thumping echoed from the hallway. Auden hurried past the dead, frozen digital displays of the home's control panels. He moved toward the master suite, following the weak sound to a heavy, reinforced cedar door, the master walk-in closet. He wrenched the door open. Inside, a flashlight beam flickered weakly, illuminating a scene of absolute desperation. Richard and Brenda Gable were huddled on the floor, buried beneath a mountain of designer down coats, cashmere throws, and comforters. Their faces were ashen, their lips a terrifying bruised purple. But the twist that caught Auden off guard lay slumped against the far wall of the closet. It was Thomas Higgins, the burly general contractor. Thomas was shivering so violently that his teeth were audibly kicking together. He was clutching a frozen, blood-stained rag to his hand. "Auden?" Richard croaked, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer terror. How did you?" "Save your breath," Auden commanded, stepping into the cramped space. He knelt beside Thomas. "Higgins, what are you doing here?" Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes glassy. "My pipes, they burst. Whole house flooded and flash froze. I tried to drive my truck up here. Thought Richard had the backup battery banks. Truck died in the driveway. I had to smash a window to get in. Cut my hand. We'd been in this closet for 14 hours. Auden, I can't feel my legs." Auden quickly assessed the situation. Severe hypothermia was setting in for all three of them. The ambient temperature in the closet was barely 10 degrees and dropping. The Gables had exhausted their body heat trying to keep each other warm. If they stayed in this multi-million-dollar icebox for another night, none of them would wake up. "We are leaving," Auden stated, his tone brooking no argument. "Right now, to my house." "We can't," Brenda sobbed, barely able to articulate the words. "We'll die out there." "You are dying in here, Brenda," Auden said bluntly. He looked at Richard. "Do we have a sled? A toboggan? Anything in that garage that slides?" Richard nodded weakly. "Carbon fiber, racing sled, wall rack. By the Porsches." Auden sprinted to the attached garage. The space was a frozen mausoleum, housing 2 luxury cars and the completely dead bricked lithium battery wall. He found the sleek black sled, grabbed it, and dragged it back into the house. "Listen to me carefully," Auden instructed, hauling Thomas up by his armpits and practically dragging the heavily built contractor onto the sled. "Richard, you're going to hold on to my belt. Brenda, you hold on to Richard's waist. Do not let go. If you lose contact, the whiteout will swallow you in 10 seconds. Auden tied the end of his lifeline rope to the front of the sled. He strapped Thomas in using the belts from Richard's designer robes. "The mud hut," Richard stammered, his pride entirely broken, replaced by a primal need to survive. "Are you sure?" "The mud hut is 68 degrees, Richard," Auden said, pulling his goggles back over his eyes. "Now move." The descent was a nightmare. The moment they stepped out of the shattered glass door, the wind slammed into them, knocking Brenda to her knees. Richard, crying out in panic, hauled her up. Auden leaned forward, digging his snowshoes into the icy crust, taking the full brunt of the headwind as he dragged the sled containing Thomas. Step by agonizing step, they followed Auden's rope. It was the only tether to reality in a swirling vortex of sensory deprivation. They couldn't see, they couldn't hear over the roar of the wind. The cold sliced through the Gables' expensive ski gear like razor blades. Halfway down the slope, disaster struck. The snow beneath Richard gave way, sending him sliding sideways into a deep drift, dragging Brenda with him. The sudden jerk pulled Auden backward, snapping the rope taut. "Hold on!" Auden roared, though he couldn't even hear himself. He jammed the cleats of his snowshoes into the underlying ice, anchoring himself with every ounce of his strength. He hauled on the rope, his muscles burning, slowly dragging Richard and Brenda back to the packed trail. For another 20 minutes they fought gravity, ice, and exhaustion, just as Richard felt his consciousness slipping, his mind surrendering to the numbing, seductive embrace of the cold. A dark, low-slung shape materialized out of the whiteout. It was the southern face of Auden's earthen home. Auden practically kicked the heavy oak door open, dragging the sled inside. Richard and Brenda stumbled over the threshold, collapsing onto the dark flagstone floor of the mudroom. Auden slammed the door shut, throwing the heavy iron bolt, instantly cutting off the shrieking roar of the blizzard. The silence in the room was profound, but it was the sensation that followed that shocked the survivors to their core. Heat. It wasn't the dry, forced blowing heat of a modern HVAC system. It was a thick, enveloping, radiant warmth that seemed to press against their freezing skin from every direction. It felt like stepping into a sun-baked canyon in the middle of July. Richard lay on his back on the floor, staring up at the exposed timber beams, his chest heaving. He slowly peeled off his frozen gloves, placing his bare hands flat against the flagstone floor. It was undeniably, astonishingly warm. "My God," Brenda whispered, tears of relief freezing onto her cheeks as she sat up. She looked at the smooth, undulating, terracotta-colored walls. It's hot." Auden was already moving. He stripped Thomas out of his frozen outer layers and dragged him closer to the inner partition wall. "Take off your wet layers," Auden commanded Richard and Brenda. "Get into the main room. Do not rub your skin, just let the ambient air warm you slowly." Auden walked over to his small, cast-iron wood stove. He threw in a few pieces of dry cedar and struck a match. He didn't need the heat for the house. The 2-foot-thick walls of compacted dirt were effortlessly doing their job, radiating the solar energy they had hoarded all summer. But he knew the psychological comfort of the visible fire was crucial for people in shock. Within minutes, a pot of water was boiling. Auden handed out steaming mugs of heavily sugared black tea. Thomas, wrapped in 2 thick wool blankets, sat trembling near the stove. The color was slowly returning to his face. As a contractor, he couldn't help but look around the room with a bewildered, analytical eye. "Auden," Thomas croaked, cradling the warm mug. "I don't understand. The power grid has been dead for 24 hours. Your solar panels are buried under 3 feet of snow. Nothing is running. How is this house maintaining this temperature?" Auden sat down in his armchair, unzipping his parka. "Thermal mass, Thomas. Dirt is dense. It takes a very long time to heat up and a very long time to cool down. I built the north, east, and west walls into the earth berm. The south wall is glass. For 6 months the sun baked these walls. They absorbed millions of BTUs of energy. When the air temperature drops, the walls simply exhale that stored heat back into the room." Richard, bundled in a blanket on the sofa, looked down at his trembling hands. "And my house glass is a sieve," Auden said gently, not with malice, but with the cold precision of an engineer. "It has no mass. It cannot store heat. The mud goes down. Or the moment your artificial heating fails, the glass equalizes with the outside temperature. You built a thermos that lost its vacuum. For the next 48 hours, the blizzard raged relentlessly outside. Pine Ridge remained entirely cut off from the world. Inside the earthen sanctuary, a strange domesticity settled over the unlikely group. The irony of the situation hung heavy in the warm air. Richard Gable, a man worth tens of millions of dollars, found himself eating canned beef stew and generic saltine crackers at Auden's modest pine dining table, while miles away his imported Wagyu steaks and organic produce froze solid in a dead $70,000 custom kitchen. Brenda, who had once petitioned to have Auden's home condemned as an eyesore, spent hours sitting with her back pressed flat against the bare, compacted dirt wall, treating it like a life-saving heating pad. She marveled at the subtle, beautiful layers of colored clay that made up the structure, realizing that what she had dismissed as primitive was, in fact, a masterpiece of geological engineering. "I tried to stop you from building this," Brenda confessed softly on the second night, staring into the flickering embers of the wood stove. "I went to the county. I told them it was a disgrace." Auden looked up from his book. He offered a small, forgiving smile. "People fear what they don't understand, Brenda. We've spent the last century trying to outsmart nature with technology. But nature has a lot more patience and a lot more power than our machines." On the morning of the fourth day, the wind finally died. The heavy clouds broke, revealing a brilliant, blindingly blue Montana sky. The valley of Pine Ridge was completely transformed, buried under 5 feet of snow. The silence was broken shortly after dawn by the rhythmic, thumping cadence of National Guard Black Hawk helicopters moving through the valley, executing search and rescue operations. When Auden opened his heavy oak door, the frigid air outside rushed in, that the massive earthen walls barely registered the change, holding the internal temperature steady. They stepped out onto the snowpack, but up the hill, the gable mansion stood sparkling in the morning sun. But as they looked closer, the devastation was apparent. Several of the massive glass panes had cracked under the extreme pressure of the wind and the freezing temperatures. Inside, they would later discover the burst pipes had caused hundreds of thousands of dollars in water damage, buckling the imported floors and ruining the drywall. Thomas Higgins's modern farmhouse was in even worse shape, essentially requiring a total gutting from the catastrophic plumbing failures. A rescue helicopter spotted the group standing outside Auden's home and banked sharply, descending to hover over the adjacent clearing. The downdraft kicked up a blinding spray of powder. Paramedics rushed out expecting to find casualties. Instead, they found 4 people, warm, alert, and entirely safe. As the medics checked their vitals, Richard Gable turned to look at the low, brown, unassuming structure that had saved their lives. A house of dirt, the village joke. It sat quietly against the landscape, unbothered by the catastrophic weather event that had crippled the neighborhood's monuments to wealth. Richard walked over to Auden. The arrogance that had defined the younger man for years was entirely gone, stripped away by the brutal reality of the elements. He extended his hand. "I was a fool, Auden," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "We all were. You didn't just build a home. You built a fortress. I owe you my life." Brenda's life. Auden took Richard's hand, gripping it firmly. "Just be mindful of what you build next, Richard. Glass is for looking at the world. Earth is for living in it. The village of Pine Ridge was never the same after the Great Blizzard. The tech executives and wealthy retirees spent the next year dealing with insurance claims, massive reconstruction bills, and the psychological trauma of their vulnerability. But down at the bottom of the hill, Auden Clark's life continued exactly as it always had. He tended his garden, read his books, and watched the seasons change through his southern windows. His house remained an enduring testament to an ancient, undeniable truth. When the modern world fails, the earth will always provide shelter for those wise enough to embrace it. If you felt the chill of the storm and the warmth of Auden's earthen walls, give this video a like and hit that share button so others can experience this unbelievable survival story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping, real-life tales of human endurance, architectural wonders, and the sheer, unstoppable power of nature. Your support keeps these stories alive.